Divorced and left in a blizzard, she carved a clay palace into the frozen earth. Ephraim Bell, who had freighted supplies across 12 killing winters and buried a nephew 30 feet from his own door in the blizzard of 73, told her plainly. If you stay in that bank when the wind seals it over, they will find you and the girl in spring. She had $11, a 7-year-old daughter, and no timber to build the walls she needed. On January 12th, 1888, the temperature dropped 70 degrees in 8 hours. But 4 months earlier, Ragna Eisenvelde had never cut a hearth into clay or roofed a dugout in her life. She had arrived in Dundee County in August of 1887 with a husband, a daughter, and a belief that the land would be fair if she worked it hard enough. The belief died first. Ragna Eisenvelde stepped off the wagon onto ground so flat she could see 3 days of walking in every direction. The sky pressed down like a weight. No trees broke the horizon. No shade softened the light. Just grass the color of old rope stretching to the edge of the world, rippling when the wind moved through it like something alive underneath. Mikkel had promised timber. He had promised a creek with good flow and a stand of cottonwoods thick enough to build a real cabin. He had promised the claim was better than what they left in Minnesota because the railroad had opened new country and the land office was giving quarter sections to anyone willing to prove them up. What he had not mentioned was that the timber stood on someone else's claim. What he had not explained was that the creek they could reach ran through a cut bank so steep the water was useless for anything but drinking. What he had not admitted until they stood on the dirt together with their trunk and their tools, and their daughter holding her cloth doll against the wind, was that the parcel he had filed on was the one nobody else wanted. The good claims were gone. The timbered claims were gone. What remained was riverbank and grass and dirt the color of old bread, and a husband who looked at it all and said they would manage. They did not manage. The first crop withered before it tasseled. The second planting rotted in a week of rain that turned the bottomland to soup. Mikkel borrowed against the next year's yield to buy seed, then borrowed again to buy a plow blade when the first one snapped on a buried rock. By October, the debt note sat in Celia Rusk's ledger at the trading post, and every time Ragna walked past the counter, she could feel the woman's eyes measuring what remained. Mikkel stopped talking about the future. He stopped talking about much at all. He spent his evenings at the trading post playing cards with men who had claims upriver, claims with trees, claims that might actually hold a family through the winter. He came back late and smelling of whiskey and looked at Ragna like she was another debt he could not pay. The marriage died in November. Not with a fight. Not with accusations. Just with silence that grew so heavy Ragna could feel it pressing against her chest when she tried to sleep. On a morning in late November, she woke to find his side of the bed cold and the mule team gone. He had taken the wagon. He had taken the deed papers. He had taken the better bedding and the coffee grinder and the small iron box where they kept what cash remained. He had left a note on the table, written in his cramped hand. 3 sentences. The county seat was 2 days' travel. The court would take months to sort the marriage. Winter would settle first. He was not coming back. Ragna stood in the doorway of their half-finished shack and watched the wagon tracks disappear into the grass. Christy stood beside her, 7 years old, holding the cloth doll with both hands. "Where did Papa go?" Ragna did not answer. She was counting what remained. The shack was not a house. It was a frame and half a roof, and walls so thin the wind whistled through the gaps in the siding. Mikkel had started it in September with wood hauled from the nearest mill town, 23 miles east. He had finished the frame and the floor and 2 walls before the money ran out. The third wall was canvas stretched over poles. The fourth wall was an open doorway covered with a blanket. Inside, 1 straw mattress, 1 small stoveplate without a proper stove body, 1 iron kettle, 1 shovel with a cracked handle, 1 hand auger, 1 hatchet with a loose haft, 1 bedroll, 1 trunk containing clothes and a Bible and the letters from her mother in Minnesota. In the corner, 1 sack of flour, maybe 40 pounds, salt pork enough for 10 days if she cut the portions thin, dried beans in a canvas bag, half a tin of coffee. In her pocket, $11.40. Every coin she had hidden from Mikkel over the past year. Every cent she had tucked into the lining of her dress when he was not looking. Outside, no wagon, no mule, no horse. The nearest reliable neighbor was Maren Dierdal, a widow who lived over a mile to the northeast. The trading post was 4 miles. The county seat was 2 days of walking, and the snow would come before she could make the trip twice. Ragna had walked the riverbank the day after Mikkel left. She had counted what grew there. Cottonwood stood in a thin line half a mile upstream on land that belonged to a man named Haraldson, who had filed his claim 2 years before and built a proper cabin with a proper chimney. Driftwood collected in the bend below the cut bank, gray and dry, and tangled like bones. She had no way to haul timber. She had no team, no wagon, no neighbors willing to lend theirs. The mill town was 23 miles away, and she had $11.40 and a child who could not walk that far in the cold. The math was simple. The math was impossible. A freestanding cabin required logs or milled lumber. Logs required trees she could not reach. Lumber required money she did not have and transport she could not hire. Even if she could somehow acquire the wood, she was one woman with a cracked shovel and a loose hatchet. Framing a cabin alone would take weeks. The blizzards could come any day. Every solution required something she did not possess. Every path forward ended in the same wall. She could not build what she needed to build. She could not buy what she needed to buy. She could not leave because leaving required a wagon and a destination and someone willing to take a divorced woman and her child, and she had none of those things. The only thing she had was the land, the bad land, the land nobody wanted, and the clay bank rising 8 feet above the frozen creek. Ephraim Bell arrived on the 4th day after Mikkel left. He was 61 years old, raw-boned and weathered, with hands that looked like they had been carved from the same wood as the wagon seat he sat on. He had freighted supplies between North Platte and the eastern Colorado line for 12 winters before his back gave out, and he settled on a claim upriver. He had lost 2 mule teams to blizzards. He had lost a wife to childbirth and a son to typhoid, and a daughter to a man who took her to Kansas and never wrote. He knew what winter on the plains could do. He pulled his wagon to a stop beside the half-finished shack and sat for a long moment looking at the canvas wall, the sagging roof line, the blanket flapping in the doorway. Then he climbed down with the stiffness of a man whose joints remembered every mile they had traveled. Ragna met him in the yard. Christy stayed inside, watching through a gap in the canvas. "Heard Mikkel left," Bell said. No greeting, no pleasantries, just the fact laid out like a card on the table. He did. "Heard he took the team." "He did." Bell looked at the shack again. He walked past her without asking permission and pushed the blanket aside. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, then stepped inside. She heard his boots on the floorboards. She heard him testing the frame with his hand. She heard him grunt. When he came back out, his face held the expression of a man who had been asked to assess a wound and found it worse than expected. "You have half a structure," he said. "Maybe a third. That canvas will not hold wind, and the roof pitch is wrong for snow load. First real storm, the whole thing folds." Ragna did not argue. She had already seen what he was seeing. "You have wood?" "Driftwood below the bank. Maybe a cord scattered." "You need 6 cords minimum to heat through winter, 8 to be safe. You cannot cut and haul 6 cords alone, and even if you could, you have no walls to hold the heat." He paused. "You have money for lumber?" $11.40. Bell almost laughed. It was not a cruel sound. It was the sound of a man who had seen too many impossible numbers to be surprised by one more. "That might buy you nails, not boards, not a stove, not feed for a team you do not have." He walked to the edge of the cut bank and looked down at the frozen creek. The clay face rose above the waterline, rust-colored where the soil was dry, darker brown where moisture had seeped through. The bank was steep, almost vertical in places, carved by years of spring floods. "What about the bank?" Ragna asked. Bell turned back to her. "What about it?" "It is already standing. The clay is thick. It faces south." He stared at her for a long moment. Then he shook his head slowly, the way a man shakes his head at a child who has suggested something both innocent and dangerous. "A dugout." "If the walls are already there." "I have seen dugouts," Bell said. His voice was flat. "I have seen men try to live in them, and I have seen what happens when the roof gives or the walls slump or the entrance drifts shut in a blizzard." He pointed at the bank. "That clay looks solid now. It will not stay solid when the freeze-thaw cycle works it. It will not stay solid when the weight of snow presses down on a roof you cannot build properly. It will not stay solid when the spring melt comes and the water rises and you wake up drowning in your bed. I cannot build walls I do not have materials for." "Then you leave." "You walk to the trading post and you find someone traveling east and you get yourself and the girl on a wagon before the roads close." "With what money? With what claim on anyone's charity?" Ragna felt her voice rising and forced it back down. "Mikkel took the papers. I have no proof of marriage, no proof of claim, nothing but a child and $11. "Then you die here." Bell said it without heat. He said it the way he might have said the sun rises in the east. A fact. "If you stay in that bank when the wind seals it over, they will find you and the girl in spring." Ragna did not answer. Bell pulled his coat tighter. The wind was picking up, sharp and cold, carrying the smell of snow that had not yet fallen. "I have seen what happens to children who freeze," he said. His voice had dropped. "I have seen the color they turn. I have seen the way their hands curl. I had a nephew who died in the blizzard of '73. They found him 30 feet from his own door. He had lost the rope line in the whiteout and could not find his way back." He met her eyes. "If you put that girl in a hole in the ground and the storm comes before you are ready, you are not giving her a home. You are giving her a grave." He climbed back onto his wagon. He gathered the reins. "I will come back in a week," he said. "If you are still here, I will help you pack what you can carry. That is all I can offer." He drove away. The wagon wheels left tracks in the frost-hardened grass that faded within the hour. Ragna stood at the edge of the bank and looked down at the clay face. She could see the layers in the soil, pressed down over years, compacted by the weight of everything above. The bank did not move. The bank did not need boards or nails or a wagon to haul them. The bank was already there. The memory came to her that night. She was 10 years old, kneeling in the dirt beside her father in the root cellar he had dug behind their cabin in Minnesota. Tolif Asen was not a large man, but he had hands that could do anything, and he was showing her how to pack clay against the walls of a potato pit. "The ground keeps what the wind steals," he said. He pressed his palm against the damp clay, feeling the coolness of it. "Up here, the air moves. It carries heat away like a thief. But down here, the soil holds steady. It does not care what the wind does." She remembered the smell of the cellar. Damp earth. The sweet rot of stored vegetables. The coolness that seemed to rise from below rather than fall from above. Why does it stay cool in summer and warm in winter? Because the ground changes slowly. The air changes fast. A blizzard can drop the temperature 40 degrees in an hour. The soil beneath your feet does not know the blizzard is happening. It stays what it was yesterday, and the day before, and the week before that. He had shown her how to line the pit with dried grass to keep the moisture from wicking into the potatoes. He had shown her how to angle the entrance so cold air could not settle into the bottom. He had shown her that survival was not about fighting the land, but about understanding what the land already wanted to do. She had forgotten that lesson. or she had remembered it as a thing about vegetables, not about living. Now lying on the straw mattress with Christy curled against her side and the wind finding every gap in the canvas wall, she remembered it differently. The ground keeps what the wind steals. The soil holds steady. If the ground could keep potatoes alive through winter, could it keep people alive too? She went to the bank the next morning while Christy was still asleep. The clay face was cold to the touch, not frozen solid, but firm, dense, the kind of soil that held its shape when you pressed a thumb into it. She walked the length of the cut bank, measuring with her eyes. The vertical face rose 6 to 8 feet above the waterline, highest where the creek had cut deepest into the bend. Below, the ground sloped down to the ice. Above, the prairie grass grew to the edge and then stopped, roots dangling over the lip. She found a spot where the face was nearly vertical and the clay looked dry. No seep marks, no dark stains where water had run down from above. The southern exposure meant the winter sun would hit it for whatever hours the sun appeared. The overhang above might shed some snow away from the entrance. She crouched and pressed her hand against the clay. It was cool, but not cold. Cooler than the air, which was already below freezing, but not the killing cold of the wind. She thought about what a dugout would need. Walls, the bank itself, already standing, already 8 feet thick at the base. Roof, driftwood poles laid across the opening, covered with brush, covered with sod. Heavy, but not impossible. The span could not be wide, or the poles would bow and break. Floor, packed earth, graded slightly toward the entrance so water would run out instead of pooling inside. Hearth, stones from the creek bed, mortared with clay, positioned near the entrance so smoke could escape and heat could radiate inward. Entrance, narrow, covered with canvas first, then hide her boards if she could find them. The narrower the opening, the less heat escaped. She ran the numbers in her head. A room 8 feet deep into the bank, 10 feet wide at most, or the roof span would be too long for the poles she could carry. 6 feet high at the center, lower at the sides where the curve of the ceiling met the walls. Small, cramped, but heated by a single fire and insulated by 8 feet of clay in every direction except forward. Could it work? She thought of her father's hands pressing clay against the wall of the potato pit. She thought of the coolness rising from below. She thought of Belle's words, "They will find you and the girl in spring." Maybe he was right. Maybe the roof would collapse. Maybe the walls would slump. Maybe she would dig herself a grave and lie down in it and never get up. But the alternative was certain. The shack would not hold. The money would not stretch. The winter would come, and it would not ask her permission. She could die in a hole in the ground, or she could die in a canvas shack. At least in the hole, she would have tried something. She picked up the shovel and began to dig. The first cut into the bank was the hardest. The shovel blade bit into the clay and rang like metal on stone. The frost had penetrated the first few inches, and she had to chip at it before she could scrape it away. Her shoulders ached after 10 minutes. Her palms burned after 20. By noon, she had carved a notch into the face of the bank, no bigger than a wash basin, and her hands were bleeding. Christy watched from the top of the bank, wrapped in the one good blanket, her breath visible in the cold air. "Mama, what are you doing?" "Building." "Building what?" Ragna looked at the notch in the clay, at the pitiful progress of 3 hours' labor, at the enormity of what remained. "A home." Maren Deardle arrived on the second day. She was 53, wide-hipped and broad-shouldered, with gray hair pulled back tight, and a face that looked like it had been carved by the same wind that carved the riverbank. Her husband had died 2 years before, leaving her with a sod house and 40 acres, and no sons to work them. She survived by trading butter and eggs to the post, and by never needing more than she had. She stood at the edge of the cut bank and looked down at Ragna, who was waist-deep in a hole that had grown to the size of a shallow grave. I heard Mikkel left. He did. I heard you were digging into the bank. I am. Maren was silent for a long moment. Then she climbed down the slope and walked closer. She crouched at the edge of the excavation and ran her hand along the exposed clay. It is wet. Only at the surface, below the frost line, it is dry. Surface wet is enough. Mud sweats. In winter, the moisture comes out of the walls and freezes on whatever it touches. Your bedding, your clothes, you. Ragna kept digging. The clay came away in chunks now, dense and heavy. I cannot build what I cannot build, she said. I have no timber. I have no team. I have no money for lumber. Then you leave. To where? With what? Maren had no answer for that. She watched Ragna work for a long moment. Then she straightened and brushed the clay from her hands. The span, she said. How wide are you cutting? Ragna paused. 10 feet, maybe 11. Maren shook her head. Too wide. The driftwood below is gray pine and cottonwood, light and old. It will bow under snow load. If you go wider than 8 feet at the center, the roof will sag. If it sags, it collects water. If it collects water, it rots. If it rots, it falls. 8 feet is not enough room to... 8 feet is enough room to survive. 10 feet is enough room to die under a collapsed roof. Maren's voice was not cruel. It was tired. It was the voice of a woman who had seen too many bad decisions made for good reasons. The banks leak. The roofs fail. The drainage never works the way you think it will. I knew a family in Richardson County who lived in a dugout for 2 winters. The 3rd spring, the whole face slumped in a thaw. They lost everything they had buried in there. Ragna drove the shovel into the clay and leaned on the handle. What would you have me do? Maren looked at her for a long moment. Her eyes moved over Ragna's cracked hands, her mud-caked dress, her face raw from the cold. I would have you live, she said, but I do not know how. She turned and walked back up the slope without another word. On the 4th day of digging, Celia Roos came. She did not come alone. She brought 2 men from the trading post, a Swede named Lindqvist and a man whose name Ragna never learned. They stood at the top of the bank with their arms crossed, watching her work like they were watching a show. Celia was 40, sharp-featured, with the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. Her brother owned the trading post and held the note on Mikkel's debt. When Mikkel left, the debt had not left with him. It sat in Celia's ledger, accruing interest, waiting. I heard you're building a badger hole, Celia said. Ragna did not stop digging. I am building shelter. Shelter. Celia made the words sound like a joke. A hole in the ground is not shelter. A hole in the ground is where you put things you want to forget about. Lindqvist laughed. The other man did not. The county requires improvements for a claim to hold, Celia continued. A frame doorway, a chimney, evidence of permanent residence. A dirt pit does not satisfy those requirements. I have not filed a claim. Your husband filed a claim. Your husband left. The claim is now contested, and contested claims require evidence of improvement or they revert. Celia's smile widened. My brother holds paper on that claim. If it reverts, the paper comes due. Ragna stopped digging. She climbed out of the hole and stood at the edge of the bank, shovel in hand. Mud caked her dress to the knees. Clay was crusted under her fingernails and in the lines of her palms. What do you want, Celia? I want you to understand your position. Celia stepped closer. A woman alone cannot improve river dirt into title. A woman alone with a child and $11 cannot survive a winter in a badger hole. A woman alone who loses her claim and cannot pay her debts has very few options, and none of them involve staying on this bank. The debt is Mikkel's. The debt is attached to the land. The land is attached to whoever occupies it. If you occupy it and cannot pay, you inherit his debt. Celia's eyes were steady. If you leave, the debt stays with the claim and transfers to whoever acquires it. If you stay, the debt transfers to you. Ragna felt the cold settling into her bones. Not the cold of the air. The cold of understanding exactly what Celia wanted. If Ragna left, Celia's brother could petition for the claim on the basis of the debt. If Ragna stayed and failed, Celia could use the failure as evidence that the improvements were inadequate. Either way, the Rusks won. I am building shelter, Ragna said. When I have built it, I will worry about the debt. You will not finish shelter. You are one woman with a cracked shovel digging a hole that will flood in spring and collapse in thaw. The county assessor will not call that improvement. He will call it a grave. Celia turned to the two men. Gentlemen, you see the situation. One woman, one child, one hole in the dirt, no framed walls, no chimney, no proper residence. When the time comes, you will remember what you saw. They turned and walked away, their laughter carrying back on the wind. Ragna stood at the edge of her hole and watched them go. The shovel felt heavier in her hands than it had that morning. From the top of the bank, Christy called down, Mama, are you still building a home? Ragna looked at the excavation. 4 days of work, a hole the size of a grave, walls of bare clay already weeping moisture where the warmer air touched the cold soil. Yes, she said, I am still building a home. She climbed back into the hole and kept digging. On the 7th day, the hole became a room. Ragna had carved 8 feet into the bank, widening the passage as she went until the back wall was 10 feet across, and the ceiling rose high enough for her to stand. The floor was packed earth, sloped slightly toward the entrance so water would run out instead of pooling. The walls were bare clay, cold to the touch but no longer weeping moisture now that she had cut past the frost line. It was not a home, it was not even a shelter yet. It was a cave with no roof, no hearth, no door. But it was hers. She had made it with her own hands, one shovel load at a time. The driftwood below the bank was scarce but usable. She had hauled 11 poles up the slope over 3 days, each one gray and weathered but sound at the core. The longest was 12 feet. The shortest was 8. None of them were thick enough to span 10 feet without support. Maren had been right about the span. Ragna stood in the entrance of the dugout and looked up at the opening where the roof needed to go. The gap was 9 feet wide, too wide for the poles she had, too wide for safety. She could narrow the opening with mud brick, but she had no forms and no time to let them cure. She could find longer poles, but the driftwood below had already given up its best. She could, You are measuring wrong. The voice came from above. Ragna looked up. A man stood at the top of the bank, silhouetted against the gray sky. He was old, 55 or 60, with a lame leg that made him lean to one side. He wore a coat that had been patched so many times the original fabric was no longer visible, and his face was weathered like driftwood left too long in the sun. I am measuring the span, Ragna said. You are measuring the span at the bottom. The span at the bottom does not matter. The span at the top is what holds the weight. He pointed with a crooked finger. You need to leave a thicker brow above the entrance. Clay overhang, 3 inches at least. It bears load and sheds snow and gives you something to anchor your first poles against. Ragna stared at him. You know dugouts. I built a dozen of them when I worked the sod crews in the 70s. Before that, I dug road cuts through banks harder than this one. He started down the slope, limping heavily, bracing himself against the incline with one hand. Name is Aslak Brekka. I have a claim 2 miles east, but the soil is bad, and my leg is worse, and I came down to see if the stories about the woman digging into the bank were true. They are true. I can see that. He reached the bottom and walked to the entrance of the dugout. He ran his hand along the edge of the clay, testing the firmness, feeling for moisture. You cut too deep before you widened. The walls will slump if you do not pack them, and your ceiling is flat where it should be arched. I did not know it should be arched. Arched distributes weight. Flat collects it. He looked at her with eyes that were pale blue and very tired. How long have you been digging? 7 days. And you have how long before winter? Ragna did not answer. She did not know. A week? 2 weeks. Maybe less. The sky had been threatening snow for 3 days. The cold was deepening every night. Aslak studied the excavation for a long moment. Then he turned and studied her. The cracked hands, the mud-stiffened dress, the set of her jaw. You are using the shovel handle as a span gauge, he said. It is the only straight edge I have. That is not why I mention it. Most people who dig holes dig them wrong because they do not measure at all. They dig until they are tired and then they stop. You are measuring. He paused. You are measuring wrong, but you are measuring. He walked past her and into the dugout. She heard him moving inside, testing the walls, scraping at the ceiling with his fingernails. The clay is good, he called out. Dense, low moisture content below the frost line. It will hold if you arch the roof and pack the walls. He emerged from the opening and looked at her. I cannot swing a shovel anymore. My back does not allow it, but I can show you what I learned in 20 years of cutting earth. Why would you help me? Aslak was quiet for a moment. He looked at the half-finished shelter, at the stacked poles, at the little girl watching from the top of the bank. Because I had a daughter once, he said, and someone helped her when I could not, and I have carried that debt for 30 years. He met Ragna's eyes. I do not help because you need help. I help because you are doing it right, and doing it right deserves to succeed. He pointed at the ceiling of the dugout. Tomorrow we arch the roof. Tonight we plan the hearth. And you tell me how much wood you have, because if the answer is less than 3 cords, we have another problem. Ragna felt something loosen in her chest, not hope, something smaller than hope, possibility. I have maybe 1 cord, she said, scattered. Aslak nodded slowly. Then we have another problem. Chunk 2 continues. The next morning, Aslak showed her how to arch a ceiling. He could not swing the shovel himself. His back would not allow it, and his lame leg made standing in the cramped space impossible. But he could stand at the entrance and watch her work, and he could tell her when she was cutting wrong. Okay, higher at the center, lower at the edges. You're making a tunnel, not a box. He traced the shape in the air with his crooked finger. Think of an egg laid on its side and cut in half. The curve distributes weight. A flat ceiling takes all the pressure at the weakest point. Ragna adjusted her angle and shaved clay from the center of the roof. The shovel blade scraped against the dense soil and sent fragments raining down onto her shoulders. Better. Now widen the curve toward the back. The rear wall takes more load because the earth above is thicker there. It was slow work. Each adjustment meant repositioning her body in the cramped space, finding new footing on the uneven floor, reaching angles that made her shoulders burn. By midday, she had reshaped 6 feet of ceiling. By evening, the entire roof curved like the inside of a barrel, rough but continuous. Aslak inspected it with his hands, running his palms along the surface, pressing his thumb into the clay to test for soft spots. It will hold, he said. If you pack the walls tonight and let them set, it will hold. The second lesson came the following day: sod cutting. Aslak walked her to a stretch of prairie grass 100 yards from the bank. The ground there was thick with root mat, the kind of dense turf that held together when you cut it. "You want rectangles," he said. "2 hands wide, 4 hands long, thick as your fist. Cut them with the grass side down so the roots face up. When you lay them on the roof, the roots knit together and the grass dies and becomes a seal." He showed her how to mark the lines with a stick, how to cut straight down with the shovel blade, how to lever the sod free without breaking it. Each rectangle weighed more than she expected, dense with soil and moisture, heavy enough that carrying 4 at a time was the most she could manage. "The sod goes over brush first," Aslak continued. "Lay your poles across the opening, then pile brush on top, anything that will fill the gaps between the poles. Then the sod on top of the brush, overlapping like shingles. The brush keeps the sod from falling through. The sod keeps the weather out." Ragna looked at the distance between the sod field and the dugout. 100 yards, 4 sod bricks at a time. A roof that needed at least 60 bricks to cover properly. 15 trips. Minimum. "How long do I have?" Aslak looked at the sky. It was the color of old pewter, low and heavy, the kind of sky that could mean anything or nothing. "A week, maybe less. The air smells wrong." "Wrong how?" "Too still. Too warm for this late in the season." He shook his head slowly. "When the plains go quiet in January, something is building. I've seen it before. 1873, 1880. The calm comes first, then the wind." Ragna started cutting sod. The third lesson was fire placement. Aslak crouched at the entrance of the dugout as far as his leg would allow him to go and pointed at the floor. Most people put the hearth at the back. They think warmth should be where they sleep. They are wrong. He traced a rectangle in the dirt near the entrance. "The hearth goes here, near the front. The heat radiates inward and warms the whole space. The smoke rises and exits through the vent you will cut above the door. If you put the fire at the back, the smoke has nowhere to go. It fills the room. You suffocate before you freeze." "What about the cold from the entrance?" "You block it. A curtain first, then a door if you can build one. The entrance stays narrow, no wider than your shoulders. The narrower the opening, the less heat escapes." He paused. "And you never trust a straight chimney when the wind can reverse it. If the vent pipe goes straight up, a strong gust will push smoke back down into your face. Angle it. Even a slight angle breaks the downdraft." Ragna gathered stones from the creek bed that afternoon. Flat stones for the hearth base. Rounder stones for the surround. She mortared them with wet clay mixed with grass, packing the gaps tight, building a firebox that would contain the flames and radiate heat into the room. By evening, she had a hearth. Rough, uneven, but functional. She lit the first test fire after dark. The smoke rose. It curled toward the ceiling, found the gap she had left above the entrance, and slipped out into the night air. The flames caught and held. The stones began to warm. Christy sat on the sleeping bench Ragna had carved into the side wall, wrapped in blankets, watching the fire with wide eyes. "It is warm," she said. It was not warm. It was less cold. But less cold was something. Less cold was a beginning. The first setback came on the third day of roofing. Ragna was hauling poles from the driftwood pile when the gray sky opened and sleet began to fall. Not snow, sleet. Ice pellets that stung her face and coated every surface with a glaze that made the slope treacherous. She lost her footing halfway up the bank. The pole she was carrying slipped from her hands and tumbled back down to the creek bed. She slid after it, catching herself on a root, her ankle twisting beneath her. The pain was sharp and immediate. Not broken, she could still put weight on it, but sprained badly enough that climbing the slope became an exercise in controlled agony. She retrieved the pole. She climbed the slope. She laid the pole across the opening with the others and went back for another. By the time the sleet stopped, she had placed 7 poles across the roof span. She needed at least 12 for proper coverage. Her ankle had swollen to twice its normal size, and every step sent fire up her leg. Christy watched from the entrance of the shack, her face pale. "Mama, you're limping." "I am fine." "You are bleeding." Ragna looked down. The fall had opened the blisters on her hands, and blood was mixing with the clay and sleet on her palms. She had not noticed. "It will heal," she said. "Everything heals." She went back to the creek bed for another pole. The second setback came 2 days later. Ragna was cutting sod when she heard Christy coughing inside the shack. Not the dry cough of cold air, a wet cough, deep and rattling, the kind that came from the chest. She dropped the shovel and ran. Christy was huddled on the straw mattress, her face flushed, her forehead hot to the touch. The cough came in waves, each one shaking her small body. "How long have you been coughing?" "Since this morning." Christy's voice was thin. "I did not want to worry you." Ragna felt the panic rising in her chest and forced it down. Panic would not help. Panic would not cure a cough, or finish a roof, or hold back the winter. She boiled water and made Christy drink it with honey scraped from the bottom of a jar she had been saving. She wrapped her in every blanket they had. She moved the straw mattress closer to the stove plate, which gave off barely enough heat to warm the air immediately around it. The shack was not warm enough. The shack would never be warm enough. The canvas wall flapped in the wind, and cold air seeped through every gap, and Christy's cough grew worse as the day went on. That night, Ragna carried her daughter to the dugout. The roof was not finished. Only half the poles were in place, and the brush covering was sparse, and the sod had not yet been laid. But the walls were packed and dry, and the hearth was lit, and the temperature inside was warmer than the shack had ever been. She laid Christy on the sleeping bench and piled blankets around her. She fed the fire until the stones glowed. She sat beside her daughter and listened to the cough slowly, gradually, quiet. By morning the fever had not broken, but it had not worsened either. The dugout was keeping them alive. The third setback came in the form of Ephraim Bell. He returned on the 10th day after his first visit, driving his wagon down the rutted track that led to the riverbank. He had said he would come back in a week. He was 3 days late. He stopped the wagon at the top of the bank and sat for a long moment staring at what he saw below. The dugout was nearly complete. The roof poles were all in place, lashed together with rope Ragna had braided from grass. The brush layer was thick and even. Half the sod had been laid, overlapping like shingles, grass side down. The entrance was narrowed with stacked stones and hung with a double layer of canvas. Smoke rose from a vent pipe angled away from the wind. Bell climbed down from the wagon and walked to the edge of the bank. Aslak was sitting on a stump nearby, watching Ragna work. Christy was inside, her cough better, but not gone. "You are still here," Bell said. "I am still here. I told you I would help you pack." "I did not need to pack." Bell looked at the dugout, at the roof, at the smoke rising from the vent. His expression was unreadable. "It is not finished," he said. "It will be finished by tomorrow." "The storm will not wait for tomorrow." He pointed at the sky. "You see that haze? That yellow color at the horizon? That is dust. Dust means wind. Wind means the pressure is changing. When the pressure changes this fast, this late in the season, something is coming. Then I will finish today." Bell shook his head slowly. He walked down the slope to the entrance of the dugout and ducked inside. Ragna heard him moving around, testing the walls, examining the hearth, feeling the temperature of the air. When he emerged, his face had changed. Not softened. Bell's face did not soften, but something in his eyes was different. "The rear wall is dry," he said. "The clay pack's well below the frost line. The hearth is placed correctly. The vent angle is good." He paused. "Who showed you that?" "Aslak Brekka." Bell looked at the old man sitting on the stump. Something passed between them, recognition perhaps, or the memory of shared experience. "I knew a man named Brekka in '74, Bell said. "Worked the road crews out of Kearney." "That was me," Aslak said. Bell nodded slowly. He turned back to Ragna. "The roof is not finished. If the storm comes before you seal it, the snow will find every gap. Snow melts. Meltwater runs. Running water in a dugout is death." He paused. "But if you seal it, and if the hearth holds, and if you keep the entrance clear, it might work." "You said it was a grave." "I said it would be a grave if the storm came before you were ready." He looked at the half-covered roof. "You are not ready, but you are closer than I expected." He climbed back up the slope to his wagon. He reached into the bed and pulled out a bundle wrapped in burlap. "Stovepipe," he said. "Salvaged from a line shanty that collapsed last spring. It is dented, but it will draw. Your vent is too short. The smoke will back up when the wind shifts." He tossed the bundle down the slope. It landed at Ragna's feet. "I still think you are gambling with that child's life," he said. "But I've seen worse gambles win." He drove away. The wagon wheels left tracks in the frost that would not fade this time. The ground was too cold. On the 12th day, Ragna laid the last sawed brick. The roof was complete. 18 poles lashed together with grass rope, covered with a layer of brush thick enough to catch falling dirt, topped with 64 sawed bricks laid in overlapping rows. The whole structure was 3 feet thick at the center and sloped toward the edges to shed snow. The entrance was narrowed to shoulder width and hung with 2 layers of canvas, one inside and one outside, with a gap between them to trap air. The hearth burned steadily, fed with driftwood she had stockpiled inside the dugout over the past week. The vent pipe, Bell's salvage stovepipe, dented but functional, rose at an angle from above the door and drew the smoke cleanly. Inside, the temperature held steady. Not warm by any comfort measure, but not killing cold. Not the cold that crept through canvas walls and settled into bones and made children cough until their lungs bled. Christie's fever had broken 3 days earlier. Her cough was fading. She sat on the sleeping bench with her cloth doll and watched her mother work. "Is it done?" Ragna looked around the small space, 8 feet deep, 10 feet wide at the back, narrowing to 6 at the entrance, 6.5 feet high at the center, curving down to 4 at the edges. A sleeping bench along one wall, a storage niche dug into the opposite wall, a hearth made of creek stones and clay, a floor of packed earth graded toward the entrance. It was not a cabin. It was not a proper house. It was a hole in the ground with a roof on top, but it was done. "It is done," Ragna said. The first true test came that night. The wind picked up after sunset, howling across the prairie and slamming against the bank. Inside the dugout, Ragna could hear it, a constant roar, like a river flowing overhead, but she could not feel it. The walls did not shake. The canvas at the entrance flapped, but held. The temperature dropped outside, but inside the rear of the dugout, near the sleeping bench, the air stayed tolerable. She fed the fire through the night, keeping the stones warm, keeping the smoke drawing cleanly. Christie slept beside her, breathing evenly, her cough quiet for the first time in days. By morning, the wind had died. Ragna pushed aside the canvas and stepped outside. The world was white, not snow, frost. Every surface was coated with ice crystals that glittered in the pale morning light. The grass was stiff and brittle. The creek was frozen solid, but the dugout was intact. The roof had not collapsed. The walls had not slumped. The entrance had not drifted shut. Marin arrived that afternoon. She walked down the slope and stood at the entrance of the dugout, her breath visible in the cold air. She did not ask permission to enter. She ducked through the canvas and stood inside, looking at the walls, the ceiling, the hearth. "You finished it," she said. "I finished it." Marin pressed her hand against the rear wall. Her eyes widened slightly. "It is warm." "It is not warm. It is warmer than outside." "No." Marin shook her head. "This wall. Feel it." Ragna placed her hand against the clay. The surface was cool but not cold, not the killing cold of exposed earth in January. Something else. Something that felt almost like 50 degrees, Marin said. "Maybe warmer. The ground below the frost line holds steady. The deeper you go, the more stable the temperature." She looked at Ragna with an expression that was not quite respect, but was no longer dismissal. "The bank is working like a root cellar. You're not heating the room. You're keeping the room from getting cold." "Will it hold through a blizzard?" Marin did not answer immediately. She looked at the roof, at the sod covering, at the angle of the vent pipe. "I do not know," she said finally. "I have never seen this built right. You might be the first." She left without saying anything else, but that night a sack appeared at the entrance of the dugout. Inside, straw for bedding wrapped in burlap. A note was tucked inside, written in an unsteady hand. For the child, not the dirt palace. January 12th, 1888 began warm. The morning air was soft, almost spring-like, with temperatures above freezing for the first time in weeks. The sun broke through the clouds and threw long shadows across the snow. Christy asked if she could play outside, and Ragna said yes for a little while, stay close. By noon, the shadows had disappeared. The sky had gone strange, gray, and yellow, and somehow flat, like a ceiling pressing down. The wind that had been gentle all morning stopped completely. Silence. Ragna knew that silence. Her father had told her about it. The silence before the planes went wrong. She called Christy inside. By 2 o'clock, the horizon had vanished. A wall of white was moving across the prairie from the northwest, so dense it looked solid, like a cliff face made of snow. The temperature had already dropped 20 degrees. By 3 o'clock, the wall hit. The wind came first, a roar so loud it sounded like a train passing overhead. Then the snow, driven sideways so hard the flakes felt like sand. Then the cold, dropping so fast Ragna could feel it falling, degree by degree, minute by minute, like stepping downstairs into a cellar that had no bottom. She sealed the entrance. Double canvas, then the hide she had traded for at the post, then stones piled against the base to keep the wind from lifting the flap. She fed the fire until the stove ran hot. She wrapped Christy in every blanket they had and pulled her close. Outside, the world disappeared. The first hour was survivable. The dugout held. The walls did not shake. The roof creaked under the weight of snow already accumulating, but it did not sag. The fire burned steady, and the smoke drew clean, and the rear of the room stayed warmer than it had any right to be. Christy was quiet, watching the fire with wide eyes. Her cough had returned, not as bad as before, but present, a wet rattle in her chest that came and went. "Mama, is the roof going to fall?" "No." "How do you know?" Ragna did not know. She believed. She hoped, but she did not know. "Because we built it right," she said. "We built it strong." The wind screamed outside. The canvas at the entrance snapped and popped against the stones, holding it down. Ragna could feel the pressure of the storm, the weight of it, like the whole sky was trying to push its way inside. The fire was burning well. The hearthstones were hot, but the cold was seeping in at the entrance, crawling along the floor, pooling in the corners. She checked the vent pipe. The draw was still good, the smoke still rising, but she could see frost forming on the canvas near the entrance, ice crystals spreading like ferns across the fabric. The temperature was dropping faster than the fire could compensate. The second hour brought the first complication. Christie's fever returned. Ragna noticed it when she touched her daughter's forehead, the heat there, wrong and worrying, burning against her palm. The cough deepened, each one shaking Christie's body, leaving her gasping for breath. "Mama, I am cold." "I know. Come closer to the fire." But closer to the fire meant closer to the entrance, closer to the cold seeping in, closer to the gap where the storm was trying to find its way inside. Ragna moved the blankets, piling them around Christie in a nest near the hearth. She fed the fire until the flames leaped high, until the stones glowed red at the edges. The temperature in the front of the room rose. The temperature at the entrance dropped. The dugout was fighting itself, heat trying to escape through the entrance, cold trying to push in. The balance was shifting, and she did not know which way it would tip. Christie's breathing grew ragged. The fever made her cheeks flush red, made her eyes glassy and unfocused. She was awake but not fully present, drifting somewhere between sleep and consciousness. Ragna held her and watched the fire and listened to the storm. The third hour brought the second complication. The smoke backed up. Ragna smelled it first, a sharp bite in the air, acrid and wrong. Then she saw it, a tendril of gray curling back down from the vent pipe, spilling into the room instead of escaping outside. The wind had shifted. The vent angle that had worked for weeks was now pointing directly into the gust. Every blast of wind sent smoke pouring back down the pipe and into the dugout. Ragna's eyes began to water. Christie coughed harder, the smoke aggravating her already raw lungs. If she did not fix the vent, they would suffocate before they froze. If she opened the entrance to clear the smoke, the cold would pour in and the temperature would drop and Christie's fever would spike, and she had to choose. She wrapped Christie in every blanket, moved her as far from the entrance as possible, and unsealed the flap. The cold hit her like a wall. The wind screamed into the opening, carrying snow and ice, and a temperature so far below zero it felt like burning. The smoke cleared instantly, sucked out by the pressure differential, but the heat went with it. She could feel the warmth bleeding out of the room, feel the stones beginning to cool, feel the balance tipping toward death. She worked fast. She grabbed the stovepipe with hands that were already numb and wrenched it to a new angle, sharper, turned away from the wind direction. The pipe resisted, frozen in place, crusted with ice. She pulled harder. The metal groaned and shifted. The smoke began to draw again. She resealed the entrance, canvas, hide, stones, and turned back to the fire. The flames had died down while she worked. The stones were cooling. Christie was shivering violently beneath the blankets. Ragna fed the fire until her hands blistered from the heat. She sat beside her daughter and wrapped her arms around the bundle of blankets and held on. The temperature in the room began to rise again. Slowly. Too slowly. The fourth hour brought the peak. The wind outside reached a pitch Ragna had never heard before, a constant shriek that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The roof groaned under the weight of the accumulating snow. She could hear it settling, compressing, the sod bricks pressing down on the poles beneath. Christie was delirious now, the fever spiking, her words slurred and disconnected. She called for her father. She called for her grandmother, who had died before she was born. She called for people Ragna did not recognize, names from dreams or memories she had never shared. The fire burned. The smoke drew clean. But the cold was winning. Ragna could see her breath inside the dugout now, a thing that had not happened since the early days of construction. The stones around the hearth were warm, but the warmth extended only a few feet before it collided with the cold seeping in from the entrance. The rear of the room, where the sleeping bench stood, was colder than it had been in weeks. The bank was still working. The clay walls were still holding steady at their deep earth temperature. But the storm was overwhelming everything. The differential between inside and outside had grown so large that even the insulation of 8 feet of clay could not bridge the gap. If the temperature kept dropping, the fire would not be enough. If the fire was not enough, Christy would die first. Children always died first. Belle had told her that. Children cannot hold heat the way adults can. Ragna looked at her daughter, flushed, shivering, lost in fever dreams, and made a decision. She could not make the storm stop. She could not make the fire burn hotter. She could not make the walls thicker, or the roof stronger, or the cold relent. But she could reduce the volume of air the fire had to heat. She grabbed the canvas tarp she had been using as a floor covering and stretched it across the dugout, creating a false wall between the entrance and the sleeping area. The space behind the tarp was smaller, barely 6 feet deep, but it was enclosed. The heat from the fire would reflect off the canvas instead of dissipating toward the entrance. The cold seeping in would be trapped in the outer chamber instead of reaching the inner one. She was cutting the dugout in half. She was giving up half her shelter to save the other half. It worked. Within 20 minutes, the temperature behind the canvas began to rise. The shivering slowed. Christy's breathing steadied. The fever did not break, but it stopped climbing. Ragna sat with her back against the clay wall and her daughter in her arms and waited for the storm to end, or the roof to collapse, or the fire to die, or dawn to come. The storm did not end. The roof did not collapse. The fire did not die. Dawn came. The morning of January the 13th was silent. The wind had stopped sometime in the night. Ragna did not know exactly when because she had not slept. She had dozed, maybe, her back against the wall and Christy's weight in her arms, but she had never fully lost consciousness. Every creak of the roof, every shift of the wind, every change in her daughter's breathing had pulled her back. Now the silence was absolute. Not the silence of peace, the silence of aftermath. Ragna unsealed the entrance. The world outside was unrecognizable. Snow had drifted against the bank, piling higher than the entrance, higher than the roof. She had to dig her way out, scooping snow with her bare hands until she could climb through the gap and stand on the surface. The prairie was gone. In its place was a white emptiness that stretched to the horizon in every direction, featureless and blinding in the morning light. The shapes of the land, the creek bed, the slope of the bank, the distant rise where Marin's sod house stood, had all been erased, buried beneath drifts that could be 3 feet deep or 30. The sky was blue, clear and cold and impossibly bright. Ragna turned and looked at the dugout. The roof had held. The sod bricks were buried under 2 feet of new snow, but the structure beneath was intact. The poles had not broken. The walls had not slumped. The entrance had not collapsed. They were alive. She climbed back inside and checked on Christy. The fever had broken sometime in the early morning. Her daughter was sleeping now, real sleep, not the restless drifting of delirium, her breathing even, and her forehead cool. Ragna sat beside the dying fire and cried. She did not cry for long. There was too much work to do, but she allowed herself that moment, that release, before she stood and cleared the entrance and fed the fire and began the process of survival all over again. The days that followed brought the reckoning. News came slowly, carried by the few who could travel, passed from claim to claim in fragments and rumors. The blizzard had killed. The blizzard had killed many. A bachelor named Lindqvist, the Swede who had stood with Celia Rusk and laughed at the badger hole, had frozen to death 30 yards from his own door. He had stepped outside to check on his livestock and lost his way in the whiteout. They found him 2 days later, curled in a drift, his hand still reaching toward a fence post he had missed by inches. A family named Grotberg, 3 miles to the west, had survived the first night in their frame cabin, but lost their youngest child to exposure when the wind tore a board loose from the wall. The boy had been sleeping nearest the gap. He never woke up. Maren Sodhouse had held, but barely. She had spent the night pounding on the walls to keep herself awake, afraid that if she fell asleep she would not wake. Her face was gray when Ragna saw her 2 days later, her voice thin, her hands shaking in a way that had nothing to do with cold. "Your dugout," Maren said. "The walls. Were they?" "They held." "The temperature inside. How cold did it get?" Ragna thought about the night. The smoke backing up, the fire dying down. The moment when she had divided the space with canvas and prayed that half a shelter would be better than none. "Cold enough to see my breath," she said, "but not cold enough to ice." Maren was silent for a long moment. "My cabin iced," she said finally. "The whole inside wall was covered. I had to chip it off with a knife." She looked at Ragna with eyes that were red-rimmed and exhausted. The bank held better than sod. It was not an apology. Maren did not apologize, but it was an acknowledgement. An acknowledgement from Maren Deardahl was worth more than praise from anyone else. Ephraim Bell arrived 3 days after the storm. He came on snowshoes, walking the distance from his claim because the roads were impassable for wagons. He moved slowly, his age showing in every step, but he moved with purpose. He stopped at the edge of the buried bank and looked down at the entrance of the dugout. Ragna had cleared a path through the drift, a tunnel that led from the surface down to the canvas flap. Smoke rose from the vent pipe in a thin, steady stream. "You are alive," he said. "We are alive." He climbed down the path and ducked through the entrance. Ragna watched him move through the space, testing the walls with his hands, feeling the temperature of the air, examining the hearth and the sleeping bench and the canvas partition she had rigged during the storm. When he emerged, his face held an expression she had not seen before. Not approval, exactly, something closer to surprise. "The rear wall," he said. "How warm?" "Cool to the touch, not cold." "The fire, did it go out?" "Once, when the smoke backed up, I had to re-angle the pipe." "In the storm?" "In the storm." Bell was quiet for a long moment. The wind picked up slightly, carrying a scattering of loose snow across the surface of the drift. "I told you they would find you and the girl in spring," he said. "I was wrong. This bank held better than boards." He turned and started back up the path. Then he stopped and looked over his shoulder. "There are families downriver who lost shelter in the storm. 3 frame cabins that collapsed under the snow load, one that burned when a chimney failed. They are asking about your dugout." He paused. "They want to know if it can be done again." Ragna looked at the entrance of the shelter she had carved with her own hands, the clay walls, the arched roof, the narrow entrance that had held against a storm that killed men 30 feet from their own doors. "It can be done again," she said, "if they build it right." Bell nodded once, slowly, and walked away across the white emptiness of the buried prairie. Chunk 3 continues. The word spread faster than Ragna expected. Within a week of the blizzard, 3 families had sent someone to look at the dugout. They came on snowshoes or on foot, trudging through drifts that still buried the roads, and they stood at the entrance with the same expression on their faces, doubt and desperation mixed together, the look of people who had run out of better options. Ragna showed them what she had built. She showed them the arched ceiling and the packed walls and the sleeping bench carved into the clay. She showed them the hearth placement and the vent angle and the narrow entrance that trapped heat inside. She showed them the canvas partition she had rigged during the storm, the one that had saved Christie's life by cutting the volume of air the fire had to warm. They asked questions. How deep into the bank? How wide at the opening? How thick should the sod be? How do you keep the walls from weeping moisture? How do you know if the clay will hold? She answered what she could. The rest she deferred to Aslak, who sat on his stump at the top of the bank and watched the visitors come and go with an expression that was somewhere between satisfaction and exhaustion. They will build them wrong, he said one evening after the third family had left. They will cut too wide or too shallow. They will use green poles that bow under load. They will place the hearth at the back and wonder why they cannot breathe. Then we teach them. I am too old to teach. My back does not allow it. You taught me. Aslak was quiet for a moment. The sun was setting behind the ridge, painting the snow orange and pink. I showed you what not to do, he said finally. You did the rest yourself. The first conversion came from Marin Deardahl. She arrived on the 8th day after the storm, carrying a bundle wrapped in burlap. Her face was still gray, still exhausted, but something in her posture had changed. She moved with purpose instead of weariness. I want to see the walls again, she said. Ragna led her inside. Marin ran her hands along the clay, pressing her palms flat against the surface, feeling the temperature, the texture, the density of the packed earth. During the storm, Marin said, my sod walls iced over. The moisture in the soil froze and expanded and pushed through the surface. I had to sleep in the center of the room because the walls were too cold to touch. She paused. Your walls did not ice. The clay is denser. It holds less moisture. And the depth. You cut 8 feet in. I built my sod house on the surface. Marin turned to face her. The ground below does not know the storm is happening. The air above freezes. The soil below holds steady. My father taught me that. He said the ground keeps what the wind steals. Marin was silent for a long moment. Then she set the bundle on the sleeping bench and unwrapped it. Inside, a wool blanket, thick and heavy, the kind that cost more than Ragna could afford. For the child, Marin said. She was sick during the storm? Fever. It broke the morning after. The warmth saved her. Ragna looked at the blanket. It was new, not traded, not salvaged, but new. Marin had bought it. Marin, who never spent money on anything she did not need, had bought a blanket for a child who was not hers. Why? Ragna asked. Marin's face did not change, but something softened in her eyes. Because I said your walls would leak, she said. I said the roof would fail. I said you were digging a grave. She paused. I was wrong, and when I am wrong, I pay the debt. She turned and walked out of the dugout without waiting for a response. But she came back the next day, and the day after that, asking questions about drainage and roof pitch and sod placement. Within a month, she had begun modifying her own root cellar, widening it, deepening it, adding a sleeping platform for the coldest nights. The practical skeptic had converted, not through argument, through evidence. The second conversion took longer. Ephraim Bell did not come to learn. He came to watch. He appeared at the edge of the bank every few days, standing with his arms crossed, observing the visitors who came to study the dugout. He never asked questions. He never offered advice. He simply watched. Ragna did not press him. She understood that men like Bell did not change their minds quickly. They changed their minds the way rivers change their courses, slowly, over years, carving new channels one grain of sand at a time. But 3 weeks after the storm, he came inside. He ducked through the entrance and stood in the center of the dugout, turning slowly, taking in every detail. Ragna waited. Christy was outside, playing in the snow with the cloth doll, her cough finally gone. "I have been thinking," Belle said, "about the men I knew who died in dugouts." "What about them?" "They built them wrong." He touched the wall with one weathered hand. "They dug too shallow. They roofed with poles too thin. They placed their fires at the back and breathed smoke all winter. They did not understand what they were building." He paused. "You understood." "I had help?" "Brecca?" Bell nodded slowly. He knew the work. He knew what Earth could do. He turned to face her. "I told you this bank would be your grave. I told you the storm would seal you in. I was wrong." "You were not entirely wrong. The storm almost killed us. The smoke backed up. The temperature dropped. Christy." Ragna stopped. The memory was still too close. "It was closer than you know." "But you survived. The structure held. The method worked." Bell's voice was quiet, almost gentle. "I have spent 12 winters on these plains. I have seen frame cabins blow apart. I have seen sod houses collapse under snow load. I have seen men freeze 30 feet from their own doors because they could not find their way in a whiteout." He gestured at the walls around them. "I have never seen a dugout hold through a blizzard like that one, not once." "Then it can be taught." "It should be taught." Bell met her eyes. "The families downriver, the ones who lost their cabins, they need to rebuild before the next storm. Some of them have timber. Some of them have nothing. The ones with nothing need to know what you know. I am one woman with a cracked shovel. You are one woman who kept a child alive through the worst storm in 10 years. Bell's voice hardened. "That is worth more than timber. That is worth more than money. That is knowledge, and knowledge spreads." He ducked back through the entrance and stood at the edge of the bank, looking out over the white expanse of the buried prairie. "I will send them to you," he said. "The ones who need to learn. You will teach them what you taught yourself." He walked away before she could respond. The teaching began in February. They came in ones and twos at first. Women whose husbands had died in the storm, men whose cabins had collapsed, families with nothing left but the clothes they wore and the claims they could not abandon. They came with questions and skepticism and desperation, and Ragna answered them all. She showed them how to read a bank where the clay was dense enough to hold, where the moisture content was too high, where the slope would shed water instead of pooling it. She showed them how to mark the cutting lines with sticks, how to measure the span with a shovel handle, how to know when the walls were packed tight enough to trust. She showed them how to arch a ceiling, using her own dugout as the example. "Flat collects weight," she said, repeating Aslak's words. "The curve distributes it. Think of an egg on its side." She showed them how to cut sod, the 2 hands wide, 4 hands long rectangles that held together when you lifted them, grass side down so the roots would knit and seal. She showed them how to lay the sod over brush, overlapping like shingles, thick enough to shed snow and thin enough to let the structure breathe. She showed them fire placement and vent angles and entrance width. She showed them the canvas partition trick that had saved Christie's life. She showed them everything she knew, and when she did not know something, she said so, and they figured it out together. Aslak watched from his stump. He corrected her sometimes, a detail about drainage, a refinement of the sod-laying technique, a warning about cutting too deep too fast. But mostly he watched, and when the visitors left, he nodded slowly and said nothing. "You are becoming what I was," he said one evening after a family from downriver had spent the afternoon learning to read clay density. "A teacher, a keeper of knowledge. I'm only passing on what you taught me. That is what teaching is." He shifted on the stump, wincing as his bad leg took too much weight. "The knowledge does not belong to me. It does not belong to you. It belongs to whoever needs it next." Ragna looked at the old man, the weathered face, the pale eyes, the hands that had built a dozen dugouts and could no longer hold a shovel. She realized she did not know how old he was. She did not know where he had come from, or who he had lost, or why he had chosen to help her when he could have walked away. "Why did you stop?" she asked. "Building, teaching. Why did you stop before?" Aslak was quiet for a long moment. The sun was setting again, the way it set every evening, painting the snow in colors that would fade within the hour. "I had a daughter," he said. "I told you that. Someone helped her when I could not." He paused. "What I did not tell you is that she died anyway. Not from cold, from fever, the summer after. She was 19 years old." Ragna did not speak. There was nothing to say. "After she died, I stopped building. I stopped teaching. I stopped doing anything that mattered. I thought if I could not save her, I had no business saving anyone." He looked at Ragna with eyes that were tired and old and somehow still alive. "Then I saw you measuring with the shovel handle, and I remembered what it felt like to watch someone do the work right. And I thought maybe the knowledge was not mine to keep. Maybe it was mine to give away." He stood slowly, painfully, and started walking toward his claim 2 miles to the east. "Teach them well," he said over his shoulder. "They will need it before winter comes again." The first disagreement came in March. Ragna wanted to widen the entrance of the dugout. The narrow gap that had held heat during the blizzard was difficult to navigate, too tight for carrying supplies, too cramped for more than one person to pass at a time. With spring approaching and the worst of the cold behind them, she wanted to cut the opening wider and add a proper wooden frame. Aslak said no. "The entrance is the weakest point," he said. They were standing at the mouth of the dugout, arguing in the thin spring sunlight. "Every inch you widen it, you lose heat. Every board you add, you create a gap for wind. The narrow entrance is not a flaw, it is the design. I cannot carry firewood through a shoulder-width gap. Then you stack the firewood inside before winter. You do not widen the entrance to make your summer easier and your winter deadlier. What if there is an emergency? What if Christy is sick and I need to carry her out? Then you carry her through the narrow entrance. You have done it before." Aslak's voice was sharp. "I have seen dugouts fail because people made them comfortable. They widened the doors. They raised the ceilings. They added windows. And when the storm came, You were right. I was both." He lowered himself onto the stump with a grimace. "The entrance should stay narrow, but I should not have spoken to you as if you were a fool. You are not a fool. You are a woman who built something I could not have built alone, and you deserve to be spoken to as an equal." Ragna climbed the slope and stood beside him. The prairie was beginning to thaw, patches of brown showing through the white, the first hints of spring pushing up through the snow. "I understand why you were angry," she said. "You have seen this done wrong." "I have seen it done wrong more often than I have seen it done right." He paused. "I have also lost people because I was too proud to teach them properly. I lectured when I should have explained. I demanded when I should have asked." He looked at her with those pale, tired eyes. "I do not want to lose you the same way. You will not lose me." Everyone loses everyone eventually. His voice was quiet. The question is whether you pass on what matters before the losing happens. Aslak Brekka died on the 12th of April. He had been failing for weeks. Ragnar could see it in the way he moved, the way he breathed, the way his eyes seemed to look at things that were not there. His old injury had worsened over the winter, and the cold had settled into his joints, and his body was simply giving out. She found him on the stump where he always sat, slumped to one side, his eyes closed, his hands folded in his lap. He looked peaceful. He looked like a man who had finished his work and set down his tools. She buried him on the rise above the bank, where he could see the dugout he had helped her build. She dug the grave herself, the same way she had dug the shelter, one shovel load at a time, until the work was done. Christy stood beside her as she filled the grave. The spring wind carried the smell of thawing earth and new grass. "Will he be cold?" Christy asked. Ragna thought about the question. She thought about everything Aslak had taught her, about the ground keeping what the wind steals, about the soil holding steady when the air goes wild, about the temperature below the frost line that does not know the seasons are changing. "No," she said. "He will not be cold. The ground will keep him warm." She stood at the grave for a long time after Christy went inside. She did not cry. She had cried once, after the storm, and that had been enough. Now she simply stood and remembered. He had taught her how to arch a ceiling. He had taught her how to cut sod. He had taught her how to place a fire so the smoke would draw and the heat would spread. He had taught her that survival was not about strength, but about understanding what the land already wanted to do. He had taught her that knowledge was not something you kept, it was something you gave away. She turned and walked back down to the dugout. There was work to do. There was always work to do. And now she had to do it alone. The secondary crisis came in May. A fever swept through the settlement, not the killing fever of typhoid or cholera, but a lingering sickness that left people weak and unable to work. It spread from claim to claim, carried by the spring thaw and the movement of people finally able to travel after the long winter. Christy caught it first, then Marin, then 3 families downriver who had been learning to build dugouts. Within 2 weeks, a quarter of the settlement was sick, and the ones who were not sick were exhausted from caring for the ones who were. The problem was not the fever itself. The fever was survivable. The problem was that spring planting had to happen, and spring planting required labor. And labor required people who could stand upright for more than an hour at a time. If the planting did not happen, there would be no harvest. If there was no harvest, there would be no food for winter. If there was no food for winter, the fever that had merely weakened them in spring would kill them in January. The math was familiar. The math was always familiar. Ragna was one of the few who did not get sick. She did not know why, luck perhaps, or the months of exposure to cold and damp that had somehow hardened her. Whatever the reason, she was standing when others were not, and that meant the work fell to her. She planted her own claim first, working from dawn until dark, turning soil that was still half frozen, dropping seed into furrows that might or might not yield. Then she moved to Marin's claim, planting the fields that Marin was too weak to walk. Then she moved to the families downriver. They had been learning from her all winter, the dugout techniques, the sod cutting methods, the fire placement and entrance design. Now she was teaching them something else. How to survive when your body failed and your time ran out and the only choice was to keep moving or die. She taught the children to plant. She taught the elderly to weed. She taught the sick to rest and the healthy to work and everyone to ration what little food remained from the winter stores. She taught them what Aslak had taught her, that survival was not about strength. It was about understanding what needed to be done and doing it, one task at a time until the work was finished, or you were... Celia Rusk came to the dugout in June. She came alone, without the witnesses she had brought before, without the sharp smile and the sharper words. She stood at the edge of the bank and looked down at the entrance, at the smoke rising from the vent pipe, at the garden Ragna had planted beside the drainage trench. "I heard you helped the families downriver," she said. "Someone had to." "You did not have to. They are not your responsibility." Ragna climbed the slope and stood facing her. The spring sun was warm on her face, and the prairie was green with new growth, and the winter seemed very far away. They were sick. I was not. That made them my responsibility. Celia was quiet for a long moment. Her face was thinner than it had been in the winter. The fever had touched her too, Ragna realized, though she had not heard about it. "My brother died," Celia said. 3 weeks ago. The fever took him." Ragna did not know what to say. She had not liked Celia's brother. She had not liked Celia. But death was death, and loss was loss, and there was no satisfaction in watching someone else suffer what you had suffered yourself. "I'm sorry," she said. "He held the note on your husband's debt." Celia's voice was flat, controlled. "The note transferred to me when he died. I am now the one who decides what happens to that paper." Ragna felt the old fear rising, the fear of debt, of dispossession, of losing the only ground she had left to stand on. She pushed it down. "What do you want, Celia?" "I want to understand." Celia's eyes were fixed on the dugout below. "I called that a grave. I called it a badger hole. I said no county man would honor improvements made in a hole in the ground." She paused. "I was wrong about the hole. I may have been wrong about other things." "Such as?" "Such as what it means to improve land. Such as what it means to hold a claim. Such as what it means to survive when everyone expects you to fail." Celia turned to face her. "I am not here to forgive the debt. The debt is real and it will come due. But I am here to tell you that I will not call the note before harvest. I will not use the debt to take your claim. I will wait until you have had a chance to pay it." It was not generosity. It was not kindness. It was simply fairness, the acknowledgement that Ragna had earned the right to try. "Why?" Ragna asked. Celia was silent for a long moment. The wind moved through the grass, carrying the smell of spring earth and growing things. "Because I spent one night in a dugout during the storm," she said finally. "My wagon broke down near the Miller claim, and they took me in, and I slept in a bank shelter they had built using your methods. It was cramped, and it was dark, and it smelled like earth and smoke." She paused. "And it was warm, and I survived. And when I walked out in the morning and saw what the storm had done to the prairie, I understood for the first time what you had built." She turned and walked away without waiting for a response. Ragna watched her go. The debt was still real, the threat was still present. But something had shifted. Something had cracked in the wall that Celia had built around herself. And through that crack, a grudging respect had begun to seep. It was not conversion, not yet, but it was a beginning. By midsummer, Ragna had taught 14 families to build dugouts. Not all of them used the knowledge immediately. Some had timber enough for frame cabins. Some had sod houses that had held through the blizzard. Some simply did not trust a hole in the ground, no matter how many times she explained the physics of earth insulation and thermal mass. But the ones who needed it, the ones who had lost everything, who had nothing left but bad land and worse odds, they built. They built bank shelters and storm rooms and modified root cellars. They built narrow entrances and arched ceilings and hearths placed near the front where the smoke could draw clean. And when the first autumn frost came, when the air turned sharp and the grass went brown and the sky began to take on that flat gray color that meant winter was not far behind, they were ready. Ragna stood at the top of the bank and looked out over the settlement. In the distance, she could see smoke rising from a dozen vents, some from frame cabins, some from sod houses, some from the bank shelters that had not existed a year before. The knowledge had spread. The knowledge was still spreading, and somewhere in the ground beneath her feet, Aslak Breka was resting in the warmth that the wind could not steal. Mama! Christy tugged at her sleeve. Someone is coming. Ragna turned. A wagon was approaching from the east, moving slowly along the rutted track that passed for a road. A man sat on the seat, driving a team of oxen. He was perhaps 40, with broad shoulders and hands that looked like they had done real work. He stopped the wagon at the edge of the bank and climbed down. I am looking for the woman who builds the clay shelters, he said, the ones that held through the blizzard. You found her. He looked at the entrance of the dugout, at the smoke rising from the vent, at the garden growing beside the drainage trench. His expression was careful, assessing, the look of a man who measured things before he trusted them. My name is Peter Moen, he said. I build fences. I came west from Minnesota 3 years ago, lost my wife to childbed fever the first winter, and I have been building fences ever since because it is work I can do alone. He paused. I heard there was a woman here who built something that could not be built, and I wanted to see it for myself. You have seen it. I have. He looked at her directly. I would like to learn how it is done. Ragana studied him, the weathered face, the calloused hands, the way he held himself with the quiet confidence of a man who knew his own capabilities. Learning takes time, she said. It takes work. It takes failing and starting over and failing again. I am familiar with all of those. And I do not teach for free. If you want to learn, you work. You help me with the improvements I cannot do alone. You bring your skills and I bring mine, and we see what can be built together. Peter Moen nodded slowly. Something that might have been the beginning of a smile crossed his face. That sounds fair, he said. He stayed for dinner that night. He stayed for a week after that, helping Ragna reinforce the dugout's entrance with a proper wooden frame, not wider, as she had once wanted, but stronger, with fitted boards that sealed tight against the wind. He stayed through the first autumn frost and the second, learning to read clay density and cut sod and place hearths where the smoke would draw. He was not a replacement for Aslak. No one could replace Aslak. But he was a partner, and partnership was something Ragna had not known she needed until she had it. The work continued. The knowledge spread, and winter, when it came, found them ready. Chunk 4 continues. The second winter came gentler than the first. The storms still arrived. They always arrived on the plains, but they arrived without the killing force of the January blizzard. The temperatures dropped, the snow fell, the wind howled across the prairie and piled drifts against every vertical surface. But the dugout held. The dugout always held. Ragna spent that winter improving what she had built. She widened the storage niche in the back wall, carving out space for potatoes and carrots and turnips that would keep through the cold months without freezing. She deepened the drainage trench outside the entrance, angling it away from the bank so spring melt would run downhill instead of pooling against the clay. She replaced the grass rope lashing on the roof poles with proper cordage Pater had brought from the trading post, stronger and less prone to rot. Pater worked beside her when his fence contracts allowed. He had a carpenter's eye for structure. He saw weaknesses she had missed, angles that could be improved, joints that needed reinforcement. He did not try to change what she had built. He tried to make it stronger. Frame is good, he said one afternoon, examining the wooden entrance he had helped her construct. But the seal at the bottom gaps when the ground freezes. The clay contracts and pulls away from the wood. What would fix it? A threshold. A flat stone set into the earth, flush with the floor. The wood sits on the stone instead of the clay. When the ground moves, the stone stays put. They found a flat piece of limestone in the creek bed 2 miles upstream and hauled it back on Pater's wagon. It took half a day to set it properly, digging out the old floor, leveling the base, fitting the stone so it sat flush and solid. But when they finished, the entrance sealed tight, and the draft that had always crept along the floor was gone. "Better," Ragna said. "Better," Peter agreed. They worked well together. They worked the way people work when neither is trying to prove anything to the other, quietly, efficiently, with the easy rhythm of shared labor. Ragna gave instructions when she knew better. Peter gave instructions when he knew better. Neither kept score. Christy watched them from the sleeping bench, her cloth doll in her lap, her eyes following their movements with the careful attention of a child learning how adults behave. "Mama," she said one evening, after Peter had gone back to his claim for the night. "Is Peter going to live with us?" Ragna paused in her work. She was mending a tier in the canvas partition, the one she had rigged during the blizzard, stitching the fabric with thread salvaged from an old shirt. "Why do you ask?" "He is here every day. He eats dinner with us. He helps you build things." Christie's voice was matter-of-fact, the way children's voices are when they are stating the obvious. "That is what people do when they live together." Ragna did not answer immediately. She finished the stitch she was working on, tied off the thread, and set the canvas aside. "Would you mind if he did?" Christy thought about it. Her face was serious, the way it always was when she was considering something important. "He is nice," she said finally. "He does not yell. He does not make you sad the way Papa did." She paused. "I think it would be all right." Ragna looked at her daughter, 8 years old now, taller than she had been a year ago, with the same dark hair and the same stubborn jaw that Ragna saw in the mirror every morning. "I think it might be all right, too," she said. The courtship, if it could be called that, happened through work. Peter did not bring flowers. He did not write poetry. He did not make speeches about his feelings, or ask permission to call on her in the formal way that courting was supposed to happen. Instead, he brought lumber. He brought nails. He brought a proper saw and a level and the skills to use them. In January, he helped her build a small shed beside the dugout entrance, a place to store firewood out of the weather, close enough to reach without going far in a storm. In February, he helped her construct a chicken coop against the south-facing slope of the bank, using the earth's warmth to keep the birds alive through the coldest nights. In March, when the first thaw began and the snow started to melt, he brought something else, a proposal. They were standing at the top of the bank, watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of orange and gold. The air was warmer than it had been in months, and the smell of wet earth and new growth was beginning to rise from the ground. "I have been thinking," Peter said. "About what?" "About what comes next." He turned to face her. "I have a claim 2 miles east. Good soil, but no shelter worth the name. I've been sleeping in a tent I built from wagon canvas and prayer." He paused. "I could build a cabin there, proper walls, proper roof, or I could build something here." "Here?" "Here." He gestured at the dugout, at the shed, at the chicken coop nestled against the bank. "You have built something that works, something that lasts. I could add to it. A framed structure in front, connecting to the dugout entrance, proper windows, a proper door. The dugout becomes the winter room, the storm shelter, the place you retreat to when the weather turns. The frame becomes the summer room, the working space, the place where the light comes in." Ragna looked at him. His face was weathered and serious. and his hands were rough from years of building fences, and he was offering her something she had not known she wanted, a future that was larger than survival. "That sounds like a house," she said. "It sounds like a home." He paused. "It also sounds like a marriage, if you are willing." She did not answer immediately. She thought about Mikkel, the promises he had made, the promises he had broken, the morning she had woken to find his side of the bed cold and the wagon tracks disappearing into the grass. She thought about the year that had followed, the shovel in her hands, the clay under her fingernails, the slow construction of something that was hers alone. She thought about Aslak dying on the stump where he always sat, his last lesson already taught. She thought about Christy asking if Peter was going to live with them, her voice matter of fact and unafraid. "I will not give up the dugout," she said. "I would not ask you to. I will not stop teaching. The families who need to learn, they will still come here. I would not ask you to stop that either. And if you leave—" She stopped. The words caught in her throat. Peter waited. "If you leave," she said, "you leave alone. I will not chase you. I will not beg. I will stay here and I will survive the way I survived before. I will not leave." His voice was quiet but certain. "I left Minnesota because there was nothing left to stay for. I came here because I heard there was a woman who built something impossible, and I wanted to see what impossible looked like." He met her eyes. "I have seen it. I do not want to leave." Ragna looked at the dugout, at the smoke rising from the vent, at the prairie stretching out to the horizon in every direction. She looked at this man who had come to learn and stayed to build and was now offering to build something with her. "Then build your frame," she said, "and we will see what comes next." They married in April in the dugout, with Maren Deerdal as witness and Christy as flower girl, and Ephraim Bell standing in the doorway because his bad knees would not let him crouch through the entrance. It was not a church wedding. There was no church within 20 miles. It was not a proper ceremony with a proper minister. The nearest minister was in the county seat 2 days away. It was simply two people standing in a shelter carved from clay, speaking words that meant something to them, witnessed by the people who had watched them both survive. Bell said a few words afterward, rough words, the words of a man who had never been comfortable with sentiment but who understood its importance. "I told this woman she was digging a grave," he said. "I told her the storm would seal her in. I was wrong." He looked at Peter. "You are marrying someone who built something I said could not be built. Do not make the mistake of thinking you know what she is capable of." Peter nodded. "I would not dream of it." They ate a meal together, salt pork and beans and bread Maren had baked that morning, and then the witnesses left, and Ragna and Peter and Christy were alone in the shelter that was now their home together. That night, lying on the sleeping bench with her new husband beside her and her daughter, asleep in the niche they had carved for her, Ragna listened to the wind moving across the prairie and felt something she had not felt in years. Not safety. Safety was an illusion on the plains. The weather could turn in hours. The crops could fail. The fever could come back. Nothing was ever truly safe. But something else, something quieter, the feeling of being exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was supposed to do, with people who understood why it mattered. She closed her eyes and slept. The framed structure went up that summer. Peter built it the way he built fences, carefully, methodically, with attention to the details that made the difference between something that lasted and something that fell apart. He sank posts deep into the earth, below the frost line, anchored with stones so the heaving of winter would not shift them. He framed walls with lumber hauled from the mill town, fitted tight, sealed with clay and grass against the wind. He cut windows into the south face and hung proper glass in them, an extravagance that cost more than Ragna would have spent, but one that transformed the space into something filled with light. The frame connected to the dugout entrance through a short passage, a cold trap, Aslak would have called it, a space where the frigid air could settle before it reached the living areas. In summer, both doors stood open and the breeze flowed through. In winter, both doors sealed tight, and the passage became a buffer between the warmth inside and the cold outside. By autumn, they had a house. Not a large house, 2 rooms above ground, the dugout below, storage in the bank and the shed, and the root cellar Pater had helped her dig beside the chicken coop. But a house. A real house. A house with windows and a proper door, and a chimney that drew clean, and a floor that did not turn to mud when the spring rains came. Visitors still arrived to learn the dugout techniques. Ragna still taught them the bank reading, the sod cutting, the ceiling arching, the fire placement. But now she taught them from a house that showed what the techniques could become. Not just survival, but the foundation for something larger. You build up from the ground, she told them. You do not fight the earth. You use it. You let it do the work that walls and roofs cannot do alone. The families who learned from her carried the knowledge outward. Some built pure dugouts, the way she had built hers. Some built hybrid structures, frame above and earth below. Some simply modified their existing shelters, adding storm rooms and root cellars and sleeping niches carved into banks. The techniques spread. The knowledge survived. Celia Rusk came to the house on an autumn afternoon 3 years after the blizzard. She came alone, as she had come the last time, without witnesses or sharp smiles. Her face was older than it had been. The years between had not been kind to her. Her brother's death had left her with a trading post she did not know how to run, and debts she had not known existed. The fever had weakened her. The winters had aged her. She stood at the edge of the property and looked at what Ragna had built, the frame house, the dugout behind it, the shed and the chicken coop, and the garden plot stretching toward the creek. "You have done well," she said. "I have worked hard." "That is what I mean." Celia's voice was flat, tired. "I came to settle the debt." Ragna felt the old tension rise and pushed it down. "The debt is not yet due." "I know. I'm not calling it due. I'm settling it." Celia reached into her coat and pulled out a folded paper. "This is the note. Your husband's debt, transferred to you, accruing interest for 3 years." She held it out. "I am forgiving it." Ragna did not take the paper. "Why?" "Because I cannot collect it." Celia's voice cracked slightly. "Because the trading post is failing, and I have no money to fight a claim dispute, and no energy to pursue a debt I know you could pay if I gave you time." She paused. "And because I spent one night in a bank shelter, you taught someone to build, and I survived a storm that killed better people than me, and I have carried that debt longer than I have carried the one on this paper." She pressed the note into Ragna's hand. "Take it. Burn it. I do not care. But I am done being the person who hoped you would fail." Ragna looked at the paper. The numbers written there, the principal, the interest, the total, had haunted her for 3 years. She had planned for them, saved for them, calculated how many harvests it would take to pay them off. And now they were gone, forgiven, erased. "Thank you," she said. Celia nodded once, stiffly, and turned to walk away. Then she stopped. "The dugout techniques," she said, without turning around. "The ones you teach. I have a cousin in Richardson County. Her husband died last winter, and she has 3 children and no shelter worth the name." She paused. "Would you teach her?" "Send her to me," Ragna said. "I will teach her." Celia walked away. She did not look back, but something had changed in the way she held herself. Not softer, exactly, but lighter, as if she had set down a weight she had been carrying for too long. The hostile skeptic had finally converted, not through argument, not through force, through time and circumstance, and the slow accumulation of evidence that could no longer be denied. The years that followed were years of building. Ragna and Peter had two more children, a boy named Tolef, after her father, and a girl named Ingrid, after his mother. The house expanded as the family expanded. New rooms added one at a time, always anchored to the dugout that remained at the center of everything. Christy grew tall and strong and stubborn. She learned to read clay density before she learned to read words. She learned to cut sod before she learned to sew. She learned that survival was not about fighting the land, but about understanding what the land already wanted to do. The settlement grew around them. Frame houses rose where tents had stood. Sod houses gave way to proper cabins. A church went up, and a school, and a general store that was not owned by the Rusk family. But the dugouts remained, not as primary shelters anymore. The prosperity of the later years made frame houses possible for most families, but as storm rooms, as root cellars, as places to retreat when the January winds turned killing and the world outside became a white void where a person could freeze 30 feet from their own door. The knowledge Ragna had learned from Aslak and taught to others and refined through years of practice, that knowledge became part of the settlement's memory. It passed from neighbor to neighbor, parent to child, the way all useful knowledge passes when it is allowed to spread. Ragna grew old. Her hair went gray, then white. Her hands, once strong enough to swing a shovel for hours, grew stiff and slow. But her eyes stayed sharp, and her voice stayed clear. And when young families came to her with questions about bank construction and sod roofing and fire placement, she answered them the way she had always answered, with specifics, with measurements, with the hard-earned wisdom of a woman who had built something impossible and lived to teach others how to do the same. Peter died first in the winter of 1898, his heart giving out on a morning so cold the trees cracked like gunshots in the stillness. Ragna buried him on the rise beside Aslak, where he could watch over the house they had built together. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that crying did not change anything. She simply stood at the grave and remembered. And then she walked back down to the dugout, the original dugout, the one she had carved with her own hands in the desperate weeks before the blizzard, and she sat on the sleeping bench and felt the warmth of the walls around her. The ground keeps what the wind steals. She stayed in that house until the end of her days, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had never known a time when the dugout was not there. She taught them what she knew. She watched them build. She saw the techniques she had learned spread outward across the county, then the territory, then the state. And when she closed her eyes for the last time in the spring of 1906, she was lying on the same sleeping bench where she had held her daughter through the worst blizzard in a decade, in the shelter she had carved from clay with her own two hands, in the home that everyone had said would be her grave. By the time Ragna Eisenvelde died, more than 40 families in Dundee County had built some version of the bank shelters she had taught. The techniques she learned from Aslak Brekka and refined through years of practice and passed on to anyone willing to learn, those techniques became part of the region's building tradition, used for storm rooms and root cellars long after frame construction made pure dugouts unnecessary. The narrow entrance, the arched ceiling, the hearth placed near the front, these details appeared in structures built by people who had never met her, who had learned from people who had learned from people she had taught. She lived her final years in the house Peter had built around her original dugout, the frame structure connecting to the clay shelter through the cold trap passage that kept the winter air at bay. Her grandchildren played in the rooms she had carved, slept on benches descended from the one she had cut into the bank wall in 1887. She died in spring, when the thaw was softening the ground and the first green shoots were pushing up through the brown grass, her daughter Christy beside her, her hands finally still after 73 years of building. On January 12, 1888, the temperature had dropped 70 degrees in 8 hours. Ephraim Bell, who had survived 12 winters on the plains and buried a nephew to the blizzard of 73, had looked at her half-finished shelter and said, "If you stay in that bank when the wind seals it over, they will find you and the girl in spring." They found Ragna Assenvelde in spring years later, but not the way Bell had predicted. They found her in the doorway of the dugout she had taught a county to build. Her face turned toward the morning sun, the clay walls behind her still holding the warmth that the wind had tried to steal for 19 winters and never once succeeded.